Republicans dead.
Where I could stand in the middle of Fifth Avenue and shoot somebody and I wouldn't lose any voters, okay?
The women with the least likelihood of getting pregnant are the ones most worried about having abortions.
On January 6th of 2021, you had tens of thousands of people peacefully protesting.
So, it's not a right-wing conspiracy theory. It's not QAnon. It's real.
Hey folks, it's Rick Wilson. Welcome back to the Enemies List podcast. I'm joined today by Robert Kaplan. Robert is one of the most brilliant and insightful authors about the state of the world and about how we think about this weird, big, messy global order that we all live in. He's got a great new book out called Wasteland, A World in Permanent Crisis. And this is a book, I think, that looks at the world we live in now with very clear eyes, because it is messy. It is not just the post-liberal world order that emerged after the Cold War, or the post 9/11 world order, but something much more complicated and dangerous and difficult. So, Robert, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I wanted to ask you, where do you see the world right now in terms of the geopolitical order, in terms of what's ahead for what are the great powers, but may not always be?
Yes, well, it's a pleasure to be with you, Rick. I think the world has never been so claustrophobic and anxious and interconnected than it is now. A crisis in one hemisphere can ricochet and create a crisis in another hemisphere to a degree like never before.
Right.
And that's why I compare the world today to a global Weimar Republic, because the Weimar Republic was a very loose-limbed, sprawling edifice, which was not well governed. It was weakly governed, and it was a daily crisis. And that's why in the book, I don't say a world in permanent anarchy. I say a world in permanent crisis, which is something very, very different. And we have common crises. We've had COVID-19. We've had the Ukraine war. We've had the Gaza war. We have, I wouldn't call it so much climate change, but tremendous climatic variations for the first time in history that affect people living in dense concentrations in places so ecologically fragile that maybe human beings were never meant to live there in such large numbers as they do today. And that explains the LA fires, the Houston hurricane, Harvey, the Indonesian tsunami. So it's a world that was literally overwhelming, where the biggest question is it's an old-fashioned question. It's one of order. Order comes before freedom, because without order, there is no freedom for anybody. And yet this is a very, it's a very unpopular thing to say, because Americans are obsessed with democracy. But many parts of the world, the issue is it's before democracy. It's just basic order. It's a legitimate governmental system that needs to be created that's not totalitarian on one hand or
Right.
anarchy on the other. It took us 1,000 years to go from the Magna Carta to women's suffrage in England, So we can't, we have to try to save our democracy, but we can't be exporting our system around the world.
There was a certain conceit, though, in America, that our system could be fully exported, that it was fungible to anyone, that inside the heart of everybody was the desire to become an American. And as our own system has become more strained, as the rule of law has become much more attenuated in America, I feel like there are fewer people in the world who have this the same ambition that this is a model that needs to be replicated, because I think right now we're in one of these crises, as you outlined, a failure mode at not just of American democracy, but of the fundamental underpinnings of it: rule of law, constitutional order, all of the things that for 250 years felt very permanent now feel very ephemeral and endangered.
Yes. In the past, American democracy was a light unto the world. The way it worked, it was a mass democracy. You had the center right, the center left. Most politics were in the middle, and they were very subtle. And it didn't really matter that much which party won an election,
Right.
But now the center is disappearing. It's moved from the center right to the far populist right, and from the center left to the progressive left. And the result is incoherence in a way. And American democracy is not the great bumper sticker it used to be around the world.
The post-war order, where we saw the great power competition between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, and a lot of ancillary things, out of the edges, ended in the 1990s, the early 90s, as the Soviet Union collapsed, as communism as a valid model for a lot of the world sort of fell apart. They understood it, I think. In this age, we now have countries that 40 years ago would have been all considered big powers, major powers: China, Russia. There seems to be like a growing market, though, for sort of these faded powers that still have one or two economic strong points: China manufacturing, Russia energy production. But they seem to devote themselves more, I mean, maybe less so for China, but more to this sort of expansive screwing around. They like, Russia is a country, a third world country with a first-rate intelligence service and a second-rate military, but they seem to have this ability to cause more trouble and chaos. Is a lot of this stuff driven in this wasteland that we're talking about, driven by the overt desire for chaos that pushes back against American influence?
I think what's driving it, actually, though it's not obvious, is decline. I think all the three great powers are declining at different rates, at different paces, and in very different ways. We can talk about America, but Russia is in steep demographic and institutional decline, and the result is aggression. And China, China's problems are more hidden because it's an autocracy. They're not out in the open. But hundreds of billions of dollars have been fleeing China. Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, has put the most complex financial decision-making into the hands of Leninist ideologues, essentially. That's not a good recipe. So I think China, too, is experiencing tremendous insecurities, and this drives its aggression. America's decline, I think, is more subtle, but it's more clear. It's out in the open. It's very much out in the open.
One of the things that I've been watching for a while now, and it struck me. I was on a TV show with somebody at one point, and they were like, "Oh, the world is so crowded. The populations are," and it's really not the case. We're about to enter into this massive demographic global collapse, where the global population is going to fall precipitously in the next 100 years. Is that what happens? I mean, there used to be an argument that the reduction in birth rates was because people were becoming more educated and getting access to birth control and technology. It strikes me in a way that some of it in places like China are increasing, and even here, increasing about a sense of like there's not a sense of possibilities about the future that existed before.
Yeah, the birth rate is a complex issue. The birth rate is falling dramatically in East Asia, including China, and in Europe. but it's actually still increasing and will be increasing for about another 20 or 30 years or so in sub-Saharan Africa and in other parts of the world. So that what's really happening is that we're seeing a shift. We're going to go from about 25% of the world as African to 40% at the end of the century, and the places where the birth rate is still growing are in the poorest, most war-torn areas. So we're likely to see more instability due to the combination of resource scarcity and continuing birth rates, whereas the first world, it's the opposite problem. Remember, before the human population levels off at about 10.5 billion, we'll still add another 1.5 billion or so to the human population in the places that that are least able to manage it. But to your larger question, in terms of a loss of possibilities, I think that's true. I think it's true. It's hard for people to make ends meet. To have 3 children or more, you have to be an optimist. I mean, there's no way around it. I mean, you have to be an optimist unless you're in some subsistence society where you need children to work in the fields, where it's an economic decision. That still happens. There's less and less of it. But in the first world society, for people to have 3 or more children, they need to be optimists. And optimism has been a problem in recent times.
It's funny because you mentioned at the very beginning, it's like order has to come before freedom, and in most societies that have a generalized level of personal freedoms, those orders are based on the rule of law. That order comes from the rule of law. That order comes from this certainty that people are going to be treated in a certain, imperfectly, by all means. Maybe freedom is losing currency, and I'd love to get your thought on this. Maybe freedom is losing currency because there is a sense. I mean, look, in more authoritarian countries like China, there's a clear sense that if you're in the correct class, a correct type of people, you're not going to be as vulnerable to the law or to the state as people who try to resist it. In America, we're right now in the middle of an experiment in the post-rule of law era. What do you see in the future for everyone? Is there going to be an anticipation that freedom is achievable under the rule of law, or do you think we're inevitably going to descend in a more atomized kind of way where people are where they go to power rather than order and rule of law?
Yeah. Well, there was a great Harvard political scientist who died about 17 years ago, Samuel Huntington.
Sure.
One of Huntington's great statements was that America is a great country, not because of the character of its people, but because of the institutions that it created. Federal, state, and local, and the separation of powers within Washington. And America would be great as long as its institutions were sturdy. And what we're seeing now is an assault on our institutions. And we'll see how that will do. You also had another question about, is freedom really desired? I think elites, and we're elites, let's put it that way. We're elite. Elites think of freedom in terms of democracy, voting, rule of law, that kind of thing. But for many people around the world, in poor societies, freedom is having enough food on the table, having safety, physical safety, order, so militias don't rampage through your town. Freedom means, there was a great English philosopher, Isaiah Berlin, who said that you cannot expect people who are hungry and live in war-torn conditions to care about voting. is so much. Freedom as we see it requires a certain degree of stability and economic stability as well.
Right. And the world feels less economically stable in the post-COVID era. I feel like there's been a sense of a much greater sense of impermanence to economic stability. And maybe since post 2008 is a better starting point of that. We're about to enter into a very wrenching economic transition with AI and with automation, where we've always had a fear of automation since the Luddites in England, 200 years ago, 275 years ago now. But the fear of automation now, as Mark Andreessen sort of gave the game away, AI and robots will replace all human labor. Any job that isn't an elite, the kind of thing we do, will be digitized and replaced by inexpensive robotics and AI. How does a world that's in this much trouble already, how does a world face that problem? Because that genie strikes me as being fully out of the bottle now.
Well, first of all, it will destabilize societies, because a lot of people will be redundant and they won't easily be able to be slotted into positions where they earn a livelihood. It'll take some time for that to happen. So it could be another layer of instability that's added. The thing about AI that I worry about, and this is a theme in my book, is that I'm worried about the power of the individual, to avert kind of mob rule. Already with Google algorithms, we act more like a mob or a crowd where there is no individuality. We just follow the leader mindlessly, blindly. And AI has the potential, if not guarded, to accelerate this, because AI will have a solution, and if you don't agree with this solution, you're just exiled from the crowd.
Sure. I think the Chinese social capital system that exists today, I think we may end up with an American version of that looks more market driven, but it's driven by these AI generated decisions. And we're seeing it already with people with criminal sentencing, with insurance, with credit decisions, all these things. I feel like that is an unanticipated risk factor of AI that has
it
not.
Goes right back to, you can't get a human being on the phone when you have a problem with your technology or something. It's that basic. Yep. And I think, and China is kind of a perfect window for this, because China, with its social credit system, essentially they'll be monitoring the internet searches of every citizen. And if I knew all of your internet searches in a 24-hour period, I would be inside your mind.
Sure.
And that is very scary. That's a real threat to freedom.
Yeah, I think that idea of the human mind has always seemed inexplicable at some level to people, but it seems like it's a lot more explicable with AI being inside of your searches, of what you're looking at, seeing, clicking on, etc. I wanted to ask you, you compare, of course, Weimar Germany and our current moment, and while most Americans are not as familiar with Weimar and the collapse of the old German government and the old German culture and its replacement by the Nazis, talk to us about why we look a lot like Weimar today.
Yeah, first of all, Weimar did not have to end in catastrophe. There were many options open to it. I won't bore you with the details, but history is about vast impersonal forces until one minute it's all about Shakespeare. you know, and it's all
Right.
about three men in a room, and one man makes a remark, and the other says, "Yeah, let's do it," and you get presto, you have Hitler, you know, in power, and that's what Weimar was about. There was a lot of hope in Weimar. Actually, it could have gone in many different directions. But basically, what Weimar was, first of all, the word Weimar comes from a town in central Germany where after World War I, German politicians and lawyers got together to devise a constitution that would guard Germany against an autocrat like the Kaiser or even an autocrat like Bismarck beforehand. And they learned their lesson too well, as often happens, and they created a system that nobody could rule. It had so many checks and balances, much more than we have, that it was simply unmanageable. And the result was a situation of artistic flowering, a lot of wonderful things, but also of political instability. And that was further made worse by an inflation at the beginning of Weimar and a depression, a worldwide depression at the end. So you put all those factors together, and you get this horrible scenario, you get this horrible result. But what I'm trying to say is our world today, I'm comparing it to Weimar only in terms of scale, only in terms of geography. You know, we're connected enough to be like one entity without governance. But I do not see another Hitler in our midst, or anything like that.
Yeah, it's interesting because the comparisons to Trump and Hitler are universal, but the modernity of Trump's short attention span and desires and lack of any other historical context, I think, reduces the risk of him as that figure. That doesn't mean he can't do unbelievably horrible, autocratic, dangerous, corrosive things, but the economy of Weimar collapsing was an empowering force for the rise of the Nazi Party. They got good economic scapegoats, which I think we're experiencing again right now.
Yeah, Trump is not a fascist. He's not serious enough to be a fascist. He doesn't have an attention span to be a fascist. He's what I call post-literate. He doesn't read. He's beyond literacy. You know, he can handle a smartphone and he can watch television, and he makes his decisions that way. But in order to grasp the NATO alliance, our treaty relationship with Japan and all of that, you need to have read as a young person, because you can't remember those things. You have to be taught them, and that comes out of books. And because he's totally unread, he has no respect or knowledge or even interest in these things.
Yeah, and I feel old-fashioned as a guy with a house full of books these days. And I see this despair of academic friends who kids don't learn anything. They go to college and they're not submerged in even their subject areas. They're not submerged in their subject areas, much less history, which has become sort of a dead end for a lot of people, or a pre-law degree for a lot of people. What do you want people to take away from this book when they're looking at how they should look at our historical moment? What do you want them to take away from the lessons that you've absorbed here over a tremendous amount of writing and study?
It's largely a pessimistic scenario, but if pessimism is the order of the day, what is the moral response to such pessimism? And I would say the moral response is to rediscover historic liberalism, not in any academic way, but just liberalism. A liberal is someone who's never sure he's right and is therefore not dogmatic and always searching, and is all about the individual. That's what Western civilization is about. It's about rescuing the individual from the clutches of the crowd.
I think that's an up note in a down story, as they say, because the idea that we have to reject modern liberalism, which has had astoundingly positive impacts on the lives of billions of people, because of an economic crisis or because of a world that's chaotic. I think that would be the biggest. I mean, that's like the biggest failure mode we could get to, is rejecting something that has fundamentally been a net good for the world at scale.
Yeah, we can't. I've never seen a time where we need. Liberalism is old-fashioned. It's like an old word, but it has a lot of meaning. It's sort of like a secular religion, and it's something we have to cling to.
As an old guard conservative, not a sort of MAGA populist conservative, it is a world built by the response to chaotic revolutions. I mean, modern conservatism built in the wake of the French Revolution. The thought that we've lost that and replaced it with hyper populist nationalism in this country, it's something. I mean, I'm not enough of a scholar of it to unwind the whole problem, but I have enough history with it to feel the tragedy of it and the weight of what happens if we lose it. So I want to recommend to folks that you get Wasteland by Robert Kaplan. It is a world in permanent crisis. It is not a cheerful book, but it's a serious book. And it's one that I hope you'll take a long, thoughtful read of, because we are in a place where we have to be clear-eyed about what we face in the world. And Robert, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today. I very much appreciate it. And best of luck with the book. And I look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you so much, Rick.
Thank you.